Hello and welcome to This Week in Review with Nigel Farage. As you probably know, it's traditional for the opposition leader to give a speech, a budget response speech, to the budget that was given by the chancellor. And Nigel, you've retired from politics, but I thought it might be interesting to hear what you have to say about the budget in a sort of budget response style speech. So take it away.
Yes, I mean, Keir Starmer, of course, did give his response. And what was fascinating was to look at YouTube and elsewhere. Almost no one watched it because he has nothing to say that is of any interest whatsoever to anybody. So there's an opposition party there that is not providing any opposition at all. And in the absence of a proper debate, whilst there were individual criticisms in the immediate days that followed, what was interesting to see was that the editorial lines of almost all the newspapers thought that, Rishi's done a jolly, well done, Rishi, absolutely marvellous. And it's kind of summed up as spend now, pay later. So we continue with furlough, we continue with all sorts of grants and support schemes, and goodness knows what fraud is coming with that. And I've no doubt that will emerge more in time. But look, what he's done is to say, okay, we're still in trouble, we're still locked down, we're not really going to be fully free for quite a long while. So, I'm going to extend, for example, the holiday relief on stamp duty for houses up to 500,000. I'm going to extend furlough, which I would say is overly cautious. I mean, goodness me, we vaccinated getting on for 25 million people. I got my letter yesterday, and I'm not as old as I look, So we've vaccinated all the vulnerable. We've given ourselves a massive advantage compared to nearly all of our competitors, and yet we're not seizing that with both hands, is my view. When it comes to pay later, well, let's have a little think about what he's done. It's called fiscal drag. It means that your tax rate itself doesn't go up, but your allowance stays frozen. Now, Nick, you and I have talked about inflation. If we are going to get some inflation back into the system, that will make the freezing of allowances for up to 5 years, which oddly takes us beyond the next general election. So perhaps Rishi's assuming they're going to win the next election already. But if we do get inflation, that means these tax rises are real. So let's not kid ourselves about that. What we also do is we take into the tax system over the next 4 or 5 years a lot of people who are only just about or are not quite paying tax at the moment. Many of the lowest paid will come into the tax system and then in many cases be compensated with a very complex series of tax credits. I've always been of the view that, and I, from 2006 as leader of UKIP, I argued this, interestingly, in conjunction with the Lib Dems, raise the thresholds at which people start paying tax. No tax on minimum wage was something that I lobbied for years. So I don't believe that the low paid should be dragged into the tax system, then compensated back through tax benefits. I think that is adding to the mass complexity of a tax code that is now a staggering 20,000 pages long. The one in Hong Kong is 300 pages. All right, the Chinese communists have taken over, they'll ruin the place. But a 300 code tax document served Hong Kong absolutely brilliantly. So that's my first observation, is I don't believe it's right to drag those people into tax and then compensate them through other benefits. We then finish up with a situation where by the end of 2023, there'll be about 5 million people paying top rate tax. How does that make sense? 5 million people paying top rate tax. And of course, losing child allowances and many other things. So it's quite a kick for the middle. It's not just for the low paid, it's a bit of a kick for the middle classes. Now, you might say to me, but Nigel, our national debt's over 2 trillion. We've got to recoup somehow. Well, does raising taxes recoup? Well, that's going to be very interesting, because one of the things the Conservatives have done since 2010 is to progressively lower corporate tax rates to make us much more competitive than the USA and most of Europe. Not Ireland, though, interestingly. Ireland's still there at 12.5%, something. I mean, be honest, friends of mine have moved to Dublin. They've moved to Dublin because they speak English, they're well educated, and it's 12.5% corporation tax. The fact we're going to increase that for firms earning more than 50,000 a year from 19% to 25%, I can't predict what the impact of that will be. But it isn't going to be a positive, is it, for overseas firms that want to relocate to this country? And now I'll give you the single most depressing thing about this budget that's barely been noticed: growth projections. So the growth projections that we're getting from the government and all those organizations around government is that we're going to be a booming economy. We're going to go up 7.6% next year, etc. Have a look at the growth projections going ahead to 23 and 24. The pandemic is over. We're not going to need furlough and all this emergency relief. We're projecting growth for those years of 1.9%. That is anemic at best. The only way you get out of this mess that we're at, it is a mess. I mean, bear in mind, when the so-called fiscally responsible Conservatives took power in 2010, the national debt was 650 billion. It's now 2.1 trillion. And it had gone up an awful lot before this pandemic hit. The only way you deal with that is to grow your way out of it. And so what I actually see looking ahead, and why the newspaper editors all agree that it was a good budget, is the country is run by people who cannot think outside the way we've been doing things for the last couple of decades. There are parts of the UK economy that have done wonderfully well. But to think that our productivity in many years has sunk below France, I mean, goodness gracious, I've never seen a Frenchman work hard. So, it really, please don't take that literally. Otherwise I get loads of abuse on Twitter. But there's no ambition. There's no ambition. And so I'm a radical if nothing else, but I'm a supporter of a vastly simplified tax system and benefit system. And I'm a supporter of growth and incentives. I will say this, I think the introduction of free ports is a good thing. Now, there are some that will say, but the other ports that haven't got that might lose. But I think that message was a good, positive message. But overall, I would say this budget lacks in ambition for Brexit Britain going ahead from here. I want us to be, a high growth, high productivity economy. And if we do that, we'll deal with the problem of that large scale national debt. We did it in the 50s, we did it in the 60s, where growth averaged 3.2% every year through that extended period. And despite the mess the finances were in 1945, we got them back, by the early 70s into a reasonable position. This budget lacks ambition. It's another tax raising budget. I know we're in trouble, but isn't it amazing? Since the Tories came to power, there have been over 1,000 tax raising measures. We are now if you take direct taxation and indirect taxation, we are now a very, very heavily taxed country. And one of the things that I've had in my email bag since the budget from entrepreneurs is, why does nobody ever think about us? Well, let me tell you why. Because the people that run the country and write about the country have all gone from Oxbridge straight into politics or straight into journalism. They've never been out there running businesses. And when you think at all the advantages that the big firms have had during this pandemic, it really is Amazon versus the local shopkeeper in every way throughout our economy. So look, I'll be honest with you, I'm much happier that Rishi Sunak is up there giving the budget than John McDonnell, although one does wonder how big the differences are. One of the commentators wrote that this budget looks like a UKIP Labour coalition. And how amazing that of the 45 Midlands and Northern constituencies that were selected for special government money, 40 of them have Conservative MPs. If that isn't pork barrel politics, I don't know what is. Now, I'll tell you what, that on YouTube would get a lot more views than Keir Starmer's attempt.
Nigel, you've mentioned everything that I wanted to ask you about. The one that got my attention was this idea of the fraud issue in the various government policies. And I noticed that one of a partner at an international law firm claimed that this could be the biggest fraud in British history. So, the government is having to clean up its own mess here. But what I noticed more than anything about the budget is, if ever there was a time to do the things you've mentioned, to lower tax rate, to try and grow ourselves out of this was it. This was the budget that should have been extraordinary, and yet it was so ordinary and signaled ahead of time. And so, for once, I thought it could have been an inspirational budget, as odd as that sounds, and it really wasn't.
No, and it's not an inspirational Conservative Party, is it? I mean, this is not a 1980s style Conservative government with big thinking and big ideas. It's a status quo government. Yeah, they got Brexit done, because if they hadn't, I'd have killed them, so they got that done. But on everything else, we're not very different, are we, to the days of Osborne and Cameron? It's still the posh boys in charge. And there's nothing radical about this government in any area apart from green policy, where they are perhaps going to be radical, although I'm not sure that's what Conservatives voted for. No, there's no imagination, there's no vision. It's about being in power, it's about having the trappings of power and relishing the fact that the Labour Party are in the mess they're in. William Hague today wrote in the Telegraph saying that Labour's predicament reminds him of where he was in 1997, leading the Conservatives against the Labour Party. And I do struggle to agree with almost anything William Hague says these days, but that I think is right. Labour, an absolute fault line exists in Labour between the hard left radicals and the moderate, or extremists actually is the word, and the moderates. But the other problem Labour have got is, since 97, since devolution, since we see more Scottish flags and Welsh flags, we now see more English flags. I mean, when I was a kid, the Cross of St. George was kind of an emblem of something really sinister and a bit terrifying. And now, little old ladies fly it from Dorset cottages. And the council estates of Newcastle, when England are playing football, I mean, they're all hanging out of the bedroom windows. So there is a much more of a sense of Englishness, perhaps at the expense of Britishness, but there's much more of a sense of Englishness. And we've got to remember that England does make up 86% of the population of the United Kingdom, a fact that so often gets forgotten, gets lost in the narrative. And there is this feeling, and it was the northern working classes that turned out to vote for Brexit. It is the northern working classes that are immensely patriotic. Their belief and support for the armed services, for veterans, and somehow Labour, with its sort of Islingtonian set in charge, just isn't connecting with these people. And until the Labour Party can connect with these people, it hasn't got a cat's chance in hell of winning power. And it also needs, of course, to regain Scotland from the SNP, who, despite the enormous difficulties that Nicola Sturgeon is currently in, doesn't seem to make any difference. Look, I mean, having said all of those things, and having said all of that, I still think, in terms of the economy and in terms of investment going forward, that there are going to be some fantastic opportunities in Brexit Britain. I'm in no doubt about that. And I still think our relative performance will be miles better than Italy, France, or Germany. So I'm bullish of Britain in relation to our European neighbours. I'm bullish about Brexit and the opportunities that it gives us. I just don't feel we're grasping it with the ambition that is needed.
Let's finish on a less inspiring note. After the budget speech, the FTSE 100 actually held its level at 6,666.66. So if that doesn't worry you, then I don't know what will. Thanks very much for joining us, Nigel, and thanks for joining us at home.